Thank you, Michelle, very much. And it's a great joy always to return to New Zealand. And I look forward to the days that lie after the conference and being able to visit some of the dioceses as well as the parishes to continue to support the work of FLI and also to help. Last time I was here, one little quick snippet. I remember, I'll leave the diocese nameless, but it was a priest that we were visiting at this particular parish, but the priest had come from a different diocese to hear the talks. And I realized that after sitting down with him that the whole reason why I traveled to New Zealand was because of him, without knowing that, and that was he just needed some encouragement. He needed support. He felt alone, isolated, uncertain, persecuted, and it was really a moment of grace. So that we never know the impact of our work. So as we said yesterday in Holy Mass, those of you who are with me, here's your pop test. All right, where's Josephine? So we know that we have five. I'm not going to call on you. Your husband said not to call on you, so I'm not going to call. What are those 5 models? All right, I gave you the clue already, right? Leadership model. First one. Second? Inspire those to a shared vision. Challenge, agitate them. In other words, get them involved. 4th one? Enable them to act. What's the 5th one? Encourage. That's exactly what that mission was for that priest. Encouragement of the heart. He was doing so many of the other things, but he himself needed encouragement. So encouragement is a very powerful thing. So I'm going to, because of each of the presentations already to date, minus the one on euthanasia, though it's connected, I'm going to change a little bit of the presentation. So the slides will be there, but I'm going to move around them a little bit because each of the presenters have already touched on some key points, some key principles. And though it's always important to have things repeated so we hear them again and again and again so that they become a part of our mindset and our framework. Very important. So I'm going to repeat, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time because many great points have been made. Okay? But if you have a question as I'm moving through, and it's related to the slide itself, I don't mind pausing to try to answer that question real quickly. All right? I want to make sure that there's an understanding. Otherwise, the point of the presentation really doesn't reach its goal, and that is to inform and to empower. And if that's not what's happening, then all I've done is dumped a lot of material on you, and it has not reached its purpose. So my purpose is to help and to have a positive approach. And so that's what I want to do, because I want to focus in on the real going forward in hope, even as we face very difficult moral dilemmas, of which we've already been talking about now a day and a half. And as one person said during the coffee break, oh. And that's what it feels like. It really does. Because you're hit with so much material and hit with so much reality, it can be oppressive. But we know where our hope resides. And last night, Father gave a beautiful presentation on where that hope is to be placed and what hope does for us. Hope is not in something that is not. Hope is believing in that which is. All right, so let's keep that in mind as we navigate forward. So I'm going to start with now I'm going to, as I did last night in Holy Mass, I'm going to put a bookend. And here's the first one. All right, it's taken from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22. And I know that you are familiar with it, but it's good to start with it. Jesus said to them, "Whose image is this, and whose inscription?" They replied, "Caesar's." At that he said to them, "Then repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God." When they heard this, they were amazed, and leaving him, they went away. So I want you to keep this in mind, because I want you to contemplate with me. Give unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Whose image is on that coin? Whose inscription is on that coin? Who made that coin? Right? But here's the first question for you as we begin. And I'm not going to answer. I want you to be thinking. In whose image have we been made? Who has inscribed himself upon our soul? Keep that in mind. So let's look at in an abstract, kind of bringing together some of my thoughts that we're going to talk about in the next 45 minutes or so. Now, the Catholic Church's teaching on contraception may be her most controversial in today's culture. Dr. Morris, Mr. John, already in Mr. Richard's presentation on euthanasia, you can see controversial subjects. But this one really captures, as Mr. John said, it does. I mean, there's nothing that really gets under people's skin when you talk about contraception. And you talk about regulation of birth and all these things. It just gets under their nails, under their skin. How dare you get involved? That you should have nothing to say about that. That's between husband and wife in their bedroom. Church should have nothing to say about it. Blah, 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 blah. Controversy. Really, it just gets people going. And it's always amazing. And traveling around the world, no matter where I am, it does. So as we will discuss, the laws governing conjugal love are rooted in the nature of the human person and his or her acts. That's from a wonderful encyclical or an apostolic exhortation, Familiaris Consortio, number 32, if you want to go back and take a look later. The slides will be available to you with the permission of Colleen and FLI. So understand the nature of the human person. Render unto God what belongs to God. Render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. True to its intrinsic nature, the conjugal act. Okay? So here, I'm going to purposely try to make language important. We're talking about a sexual act, all right? But we're going to refer to it in the language of the church. It's a conjugal act. Very important to understand what's the purpose of this conjugal act. What's the purpose of conjugal love? And conjugal, by its very nature, is referencing husband and wife. It's referencing where this act is only to occur, and that is between spouses, because that is where God himself has created it to be expressed, and only expressed. And that's why it's intrinsic to its very nature. The conjugal act itself is love. It unifies, it unites, and it has the capacity to engendering human life. By its very nature, this act expresses love, it expresses unity, and it expresses the capacity of engendering human life. Again, this is just an abstract. We're just walking our way through, and I got to find the right button. So conjugal love, the spouse speaks themselves through their bodies. Now, these are just, again, points. I'm going to talk about them. The spouses speak themselves through their bodies. Again, familiaris consortio. And the language of the body is rooted in the very nature. Where is it rooted? In the very nature of who? You can read with me. Rooted in the very nature of the human person and his or her destiny. Good, you're paying attention. Just making sure, right? Just making sure. I know it's after lunch. All those calories are in the stomach going, why it's not time for a nap, please. All right? In other words, the conjugal love, the spouses, all right, in this conjugal love of spouses, as male and female, they speak their marriage together. They speak in a language, all right? And they become one sacred word. They speak one language, a single sacred word. Now here, we're going to refer back to St. Paul VI in his document, Humanae Vitae, paragraph here, number 7. Now I'm going to read it in full because I wanted to make sure that it sits with us. Married love particularly reveals its true nature, right? We hear that word nature coming back in this conversation, true nature and nobility, when we realize that it takes its origin from where? God. From God, who is. So what were those three intrinsic points of the conjugal act? Love, unity, and the capacity to engender life. Takes its origin from God. Render unto who? God what belongs to God. Keep this in mind. Who is love? The Father from whom every family in heaven on earth is named. Mr. John made note of that. Marriage then is far from being the effect of chance. are the result of the blind evolution of natural forces. Here, he's going against those who are talking about it's purely a biological act. It's just a natural act between body persons. All right? It is in reality the wise and provident institution of God the Creator, whose purpose was to effect in man his loving design, God's design. As a consequence, husband and wife, through the mutual gift of themselves, back to the language of the body, develop that union of two persons in which they perfect one another, cooperating with God in the generation and rearing of new lives. Love, unity, capacity to engender human life, to fulfill the very nature that God has designed. In sum, in this little brief moment, primarily an affirmation of great goods. That's what I want us to hopefully walk away with, is looking at this as a great good, something beautiful, something precious that God has created for the good of his people and a sharing in life itself. And we're going to talk about what that means. So primarily an affirmation of great goods. The church's perennial teaching on human sexuality, love, and marriage is founded upon her sincere concern for the flourishing and well-being of the human person. Dr. Morrison, one of her slides, made note in talking about the commandment, thou shalt, in a sense, it wasn't, I think it was not thou shalt not kill. I forget which slide it was, but you showed how it said it in a negative, but then you turned it around and said, well, let's look at what it speaks of positively. And that's what I want us to focus on, all right? Not on thou cannot do, but why? Because God, our Father, who seeks only our well-being and only our salvation, only seeks that which is good in us. And so if God has so given a command, that command is given because it is good. He's trying to protect us from something harmful. And that's why I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this. What Dr. Morris did by showing all the consequences of this sexual revolution and all that began as a consequence of those decisions speaks for itself. This is exactly what Paul VI was trying to protect us from. All right? This is what God the Father has been trying to protect us from. The harms of acts and choices that are contrary to our nature and contrary to God's design. To use something contrary to his design, all right? Now let me use a phrase. And those who have been with me, maybe even on the podcast, have seen, you can put lipstick on a pig. It's still a pig. You can call it what you want. And people have tried to redefine contraception, trying to make it something good, but by its very nature, contra, it's against a good. And no matter how we try to redefine it, re-explain it, clean it all up, put lipstick on it, it still is an intrinsic evil. And it can never be chosen. And that's why, because we need to look at what is the good that God wants me to live. What is the good? However, when spouses contracept or purposely are sterilized, they violate the good of the spouses, the good of conjugal love, and the good of the conjugal act. They falsify the conjugal meaning of the body, and they fail to respect their own human dignity. So that's just a summary. But I wanted to make sure that we understand what it is that we're speaking about. Now, by no means, in the time that we have, we're going to go through all these wonderful points on this slide. But just in case the next presenter doesn't show up, I came prepared. You never know. Never know. I did hide his keys. All right, so we're going to start with this slide. This is another little part, kind of not a bookend, because our first big bookend is render unto God what belongs to God, and render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Here, I want to use a phrase that you may be familiar with, or may have something similar here in your own beloved country. Here it is said, as the twig is bent, so goes the tree. If the twig begins its journey by crookedly growing, then we already know how it will look as it reaches maturity. So think about that. So if this twig, so let's just start with the idea. So spouses decide to choose something that is intrinsically evil and opposed to their human dignity, opposed to the very nature of conjugal love. What happens is that twig starts growing crooked. What are the consequences of that growing crookedly? It will continue to stay in that crooked manner and continue to head down a path of which now today, as Dr. Morse clearly noted, what do we happen with high divorce rates, high separation, marital problems, breakdown of the family, children suffer, and Father Marx had a wonderful way of putting things in such a, just kind of get right and smack you in the face. He said, contracepting parents produce fornicating children. Because if we are opposed to what God's design is, then what are we passing on to the children? Because they see the fruit of it. They realize that, something is not right here. They see it. So it's important for us to take a look. So I want to start with human dignity, because it's the good that we're talking about, the human person. So here, quoting again from the Catholic Church's teaching, the human person alone is called to share by knowledge and love of God in God's own life. Only the human person, no other creature on this planet is made for this. Only the human person, man and woman. This is the fundamental reason for our dignity. Being in the image of God, the human individual possesses the dignity of a person who is not just something, but someone. So when we misuse a good, we are actually hurting ourselves. We are misusing the good that God wishes us to have this good for, our well-being and our flourishing. Human dignity refers to the intrinsic, Mr. Richard pointed this out, this incomparable, this inviolable dignity, all right, this absolute, and it never changes, no matter what stage of life, whether at the very moment of conception until its very natural end, that dignity remains the same. It doesn't become diminished in any moment, in any way, ever. Very important, right? So what we have is image and likeness. And I'm trying to really paint for us so that when we begin to think of conjugal love, think of marriage, and we think of the conjugal act, and we think of what this good is, that who is the origin of this good is God, and God has designed it to be a reflection of himself, his own love. There's something unique about the human person, something about God's image and likeness in man and woman that is not found, as I said, in any other creature. A human person has a freedom to choose to be more fully who he is and meant to be, which is God-like. Or he can choose to refuse it. There's that freedom. But as Scripture teaches us, we are not made for sin. We are made for holiness. To be more like God is to be good as God is good. To love more fully, sacrificial service to others. To be true as God is true. To know reality in conformity to the way that God knows it. Again, purpose, what God has created it for. To be beautiful as God is beautiful, seeing the beauty of God's image and presence in his creation. To become creators ourselves, especially for spouses, by making beautiful things as God makes beautiful things. To choose to use our creativity virtuously, and to use the gift in conformity to the will of God, or for our own prideful purposes, which is never meant to be chosen. Now, very briefly, and again, Dr. Morris already spoke about this current cultural climate, this dualistic philosophy that we see running rampant in our culture. In our permissive culture, love, which means here happiness and pleasure in the world, is sometimes so idolized that it is separated from sacrifice. Mr. Richard, in his presentation about euthanasia, gave a clear understanding of what happens when in Evangelium Vitae, when John Paul II speaks about the very fact in referencing euthanasia, that people put to death the very people they should be caring for. Death should not be ever the answer to the need of a brother and sister. That is never the answer. Because why? Because we're dealing with a human person who has inalienable dignity that can never be violated by themselves or by anyone else. And so, again, it's important to keep this in mind. This makes hard moral choices when we have this mindset that we see in the permissive culture, that love is about happiness and about pleasure. All right? And so the absence of sacrificial love, and you can see how this affects marriage, conjugal love, the conjugal act. The absence of a sacrificial love prevents the possibility of an authentic moral life. How can I lead a life that I'm called to live, that supernatural life? I'm called to live this life abundantly, as Jesus teaches us in John 10, and that we are to live it fully and completely if I'm living in opposition to the will of God. If I'm living in complete denial of what God has created myself, my body, my sexuality for. I'm falsifying this. Unmoored from that moral direction, love alone can easily descend into sentimentality. And that's where we are. That's where the culture is. I feel, I want, I do. It's all about this, putting us at the mercy of our feelings. So what do we have here? We have a rejection of the Judeo-Christian root. We have a rejection of it. So in the West, for nearly a century, that there has been that steady rejection. And New Zealand is right in the heart of it, right? Morality, this root of the Judeo-Christian morality in favor of what? Of secular values and moral relativism. And we don't have time to walk through that, but if you're looking for something, really just Google, look up Pope Benedict XVI, look up moral relativism. He spoke about this very, very often. As it often is the case, what seems like a sudden explosion, and again, Dr. Morris said, it's like, where did this come from, this whole gender dysphoria, this whole transgender issue, and all the various sex revolutions? This just came up overnight, didn't it? No, it has not. We can go all the way back to the 14th and 15th century, and we can already see the very foundation of the arguments beginning. This is not a sudden explosion. And as each of the presenters have done, you can see, just like, again, I refer to Dr. Morris because being from South Louisiana and hurricanes, all right? You know, you look at that picture and you see one telephone pole over and you say, what would cause that to go over? And then you take a larger view and the entire city is devastated. What in the world caused that? Right? The same thing here. What's caused all this? Well, here we are. What's happened, that sudden explosion, but really it's a logical outcome of hundreds of years of growing confusion about who we are as persons and our relationship with our Creator and with each other. So this is what the heart of it is. So again, Dr. Morris gave a fantastic understanding of the whole background and backdrop. I'm not going to spend time with this, but on the second point. This dualistic view is assumed by most today. This is how people live. Even though most don't even realize why they do what they do, or don't see how that view informs their decision-making, or their assumptions, or the reality of their daily living. They just don't see it. And that's why when we point it out, it's us that they fight against. You know, they don't understand. But that's where, again, we come in to come and promote those goods. So let's look at it. So what's the philosophy? Simply put, this is what it really would mean if I were summarizing it. This is my own little definition. You are your mind, and you are your body. You have a body. As opposed to the traditional Christian view that you are both body and soul. You can see that dualism just splits them apart. That's why when we hear people who promote and advocate, for the great tenets of the sexual revolution, especially with regard to contraception and abortion, they say, it's my body, right? And that's the language, right? And so what happens, you have to confront that by reintroducing a different ideology and helping them understand that, no, you are not just a body. And that's very important to get into. So what's the impact? Instead of beginning with the idea that we grasp reality through our senses and think about it, all right, using the gift of intelligibility and the rational thought and considering those things in front of us and using what's been revealed to us in Revelation, what's been revealed to us in the teaching of our church, what God has himself revealed to us in his ordained will. And so now we begin with our own mind. We begin with ourselves as the basis of knowledge. So I'm not looking for an objective truth outside that guides my conscience. Now I create my own truth and follow my own design and my own path. And where does that lead me? Purely down a path of subjectivism. So what are the consequences? We can see how these dualistic views affects our lives. It affects our own understanding of our bodies. All right? So for example, let's go back to Mr. Richard's presentation on euthanasia. So we have a couple of doctors here. So if the doctors here actually would buy into the philosophy of this dualistic position, that basically your body's dying, your body's going through this process. Well, let me just let's put this all to an end. Not considering the fact that we're dealing with a body soul. We're dealing with an immortal soul. We're dealing with someone made in the image and likeness of God, someone who has dignity. If I don't consider that, then I can treat this thing as if it were an empty water bottle. All right? Water's empty out of the bottle? Well, just dispose of the bottle. So you can see how this can affect the way that we act and what we do. So let's look at this as a rational, all right? And again, trying to plant a seed for us to look at how we approach this subject, all right? So what enables a human person to be free is what? The ability to reason. The human person is a rational being. The human person is able to weigh and measure different courses of action, to determine which actions are good and bad, can cooperate with his nature or act against it, while other natural things have no such freedom. A human person has parts, operations, and instincts that enable him or her to function well and to flourish. Since a human person is by nature a rational being, it is good for him to act in accord with his reason. When the human person acts rationally, he acts in accord with his own nature and reality, and in accord with the nature and reality of other things. Right? You doing okay? Sure? All right, I'm looking at your faces. All right. Okay. So we're going to look right now just really at the moral life. In order for us to understand the goods that we're trying to protect, the goods that we're trying to advance, and the goods that we're trying to encourage people to live, we have to understand how do we get to this point of recognizing this good and then living in accord with that which God has designed for us. So Jesus says, as I quote here from John 15, if you love me, you keep my commands. Right? You keep them. You respect them. You honor them. So the church teaches that the moral life consists in choosing those actions and developing those virtues by means of which people pursue their own good and the good of others and enter into communion with God, their supreme good. So for those of you who are married here today, how does this vision shape your marriage? How does this understanding that the church places before us, how is that lived within your marital life? Do you have this kind of vision for each other? Do you see this vision lived out in how you approach your spouse daily? How you approach being parents? How you approach daily life as a family? For myself as a priest, how does this shape my priestly life daily? That to recognize that I'm to choose actions that develop those virtues by means by which not only I pursue the good, but that I want the good for others. So what happens when we introduce something contrary, when we falsify a good, we're actually causing harm. We're harming not only ourselves, but we're harming others. We're causing harm. When we ask someone to participate in an evil, we're hurting them, and we're hurting ourselves, and we're hurting our society. Our culture espouses a notion of freedom. We just heard that in Mr. Richard's presentation about this ordained autonomy. I am free to do whatever I want, which is false. That's a false. All right? Our culture espouses a notion of freedom of choice as a power to do whatever one desires without reference to any evaluative or objective realities or truths. Freedom is without restraint. That's what it means to our secular world. There can be no negative consequences from something good that someone has chosen that they want for themselves. Society believes freedom to be synonymous with happiness. That's how they vision it. Based on this view, every behavior treats the human person as something to be used rather than someone, a gift to be received. Now, I hope right now your mind is thinking. I'm purposely trying to push your mind to go back to the abstract that I began with. The intrinsic nature of the conjugal act is love, unity, and the capacity to engender human life. That this is what the intrinsic nature of that act is about. Anything contrary to that falsifies that act. It harms spouses. So what happens when we begin to treat our spouse or another human being as something? Now, most people who are participating, sadly, in a decision to use contraception or maintain the contraceptive mentality, they don't wake up and think how I'm going to use this person, but it becomes a usury in time. And Paul VI talked about this in Humanae Vitae. What happens when this mindset becomes so entrenched that a person begins to think they have a right to something? They have a right to act this way. They have a right to pursue whatever it is they pursue. No sacrificial love, no sacrificial understanding, no mindset of the good of the other. It all is focused on the self. Human freedom is the God-given power to become who God created us to be, and so to share eternal union with Him. And that's what Mr. John talked about. In the sense of that looking at that hierarchy of goods. This is the supreme good, to be in unity with God. This happens when we consistently choose ways that are in harmony with God's plan. That's when I am free. That's true freedom. So with that, what's the basic principle of the moral life? It is the awareness that every person bears this dignity and is made in the image and likeness of God. So, for those of you, again, who are married, do you have that vision for your spouse? When you see your spouse, do you see this beautiful person with this inalienable dignity who is made in the image and likeness of God? That this person you serve, you care about, you sacrifice for, that you do everything you can out of love for, and you strive to make their lives happy and peaceful, and you try to fill it with as much love as you can fill up anything. Every day you wake up and consider what's the best thing I can do for them. And we're not talking about material things here. It can be, but I'm talking about to make their good your desire every day. Is that how we wake up? Do I wake up that way and think about the people of God that God has asked me to serve? Do I have that capacity within me as well to engender life? So even though I'm a priest, a celibate, I'm still called to engender human life, just differently. So how can I say, how many children do I have? So it's important for us to think. Now that could be dangerous. That's another one being recorded here. So I have no biological children. Let's make it very clear. All right? Lots of spiritual children. Let's get that on the record, okay? So, God has given me an immortal soul. And through the gifts of intelligence and reason, repeating these again, we are enabled to understand the order of things established in God's creation. God has given us a free will to seek and to love what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. Now, what are those? The transcendentals. Very important for us to be mindful of. So I'm going to briefly walk through this, and then we're going to jump to the understanding of marriage itself. Every moral act consists of three elements. The objective act, what we do. The subjective goal or intention, why we do the act. The concrete situation or circumstances in which we perform that act. The when, the where, the how, with whom, the consequences. For an individual act to be morally good, the object or what we are doing must be objectively good. So again, if I'm choosing that which is intrinsically evil, it's not good. It's not that which I can choose. Apart from the intention or reason for doing them, there could be, quote, a good reason. But some acts are always wrong because they go against the fundamental or basic human good that ought never to be compromised. The goal, end, or intention of a moral act is the part of the moral act that lies within the person. For an act to be morally good, one's intention must be good. So objectively good, that intention must be good. And if we are motivated to do something by a bad intention, so for example, my spouse and I may have reason to postpone a pregnancy, but to choose contraception in order to obtain that end is never permissible. Ever. Even something that is objectively good, our action is morally evil. A good intention cannot make a bad action something intrinsically good or evil or good. So again, let's go back. I put lipstick on a pig, it's still a pig. I can bathe it, clean it, dress it up, it's still a pig. End of the day, we can never do something wrong or evil in order to bring about a good. The end does not justify the means. My purpose here, my friends, is to establish, as we talk about the good of marriage, we talk about the good of spouses, we talk about the good of conjugal love and the good of the conjugal act. And so as we try to talk about these goods and to advance these goods, we need to understand why these goods are presented to us and then also understand what can harm them, what causes harm to them. And why, when we try to work with, especially with young couples who are anticipating marriage, to understand why purity, chastity, and why understanding these are values and goods that they should want and obtain, and why within marriage there should always be this openness to human life. So contraception is an example of an act that is always wrong. This is what John Paul says, Veritatis Splendor. Such acts are referred to as intrinsically evil acts, meaning that they are wrong in themselves, apart from the reason they are done or the circumstances surrounding them. By their very nature, they are never and can never be chosen. So it's good for us to think about that. I'm not going to go through the contraceptive ideology too strongly because, again, Dr. Moore spent ample time going through that, but we all know what the purpose of contraception is. It's to separate intercourse from procreation. That's its intention. That's what it's done for. And so contracepting partners want to enjoy the pleasures of sex, the so-called conjugal act, but it's no longer a conjugal act when they contracept because it's lost its conjugal meaning. So it's no longer a conjugal act. It's actually a biological act. Now we've turned it into something it's not meant to be. So this is the danger, the harm that begins to happen here. So what are the promises that we hear? And Dr. Morris, again, went through that. The promoters of contraception promise a consequence-free control over their lives if we could just control our fertility and their drugs and devices, with their drugs and devices. All the pleasure, none of the inconvenient fertility. So we're basically looking at this, that I love you, honey, but I don't love your fertility. I don't love the fact that you are fertile. So I say I love everything about you, but really? And that's supposed to reflect love. My body is not me exactly. It is an object for me to control for whatever reason I want. So sex is just about my pleasure, maybe someone else's pleasure. It is not necessarily about giving myself to one I love with the possibility of engendering, creating new life. So we've changed the act. So what are the consequences? So sex becomes a mindless, meaningless function for which I can use my body, a matter of self-expression or self-fulfillment. The idea of myself as a unity of body and soul is gone. With this view follows the misunderstanding of the nature of human sexuality as a unity of basic human gifts, of fertility and bonding between spouses, the ends of marriage, the unitive and procreative. Responsibility, morality, self-mastery, self-giving, and sacredness belong to any Christian view of the human person or of human sexuality. From the view of the secular world, are absent and outwardly rejected when that contraceptive mentality, ideology takes root. And isn't that what Paul VI, if you don't mind me asking, the camera's pointed at me mostly, how many of you, my dear brothers and sisters, have ever read Humanae Vitae in its fullness? There's much, much to learn. I would strongly encourage you to do so. And to read it, it's one of the shortest encyclicals of modern day, and it's packed. It is worth the time. So the inevitable consequences of such a point of view is that contraceptive mentality. Sexuality is divorced not only from possible procreation, but again because it changes the marital act. It changes it. And so marriage itself is also divorced. This understanding is changed. Now here is a document, and way at the bottom, I know it may be very small print, but if you want to read something again that's, I think, very important as we advocate for life and family and advocate for marriage and advocate for the gift of what marriage offers, The Truth and Meaning of Human Sexuality is a good document, and that's where I'm quoting from here. This is what the document says. There's been an eclipse of the truth about man, which, among other things, exerts pressure to reduce sex to something commonplace. In society and the mass media, sex is presented as depersonalized, a depersonalized way, infused with a distorted, individualistic concept of freedom that treats sex as merely recreational and in a way that does not consider the various developmental stages of children. So that's where I'm going to leave it, because I want to jump a little bit into the final part of that. And so I'm just laid that work down for the principles and understanding. And now what I want to do is just kind of look at this last slide and then move in a little bit deeper into those goods. The contraceptive state of mind. The other ways of expressing this mentality: contraceptive attitude, contraceptive morality, and a contraceptive culture. You can see how it moves. An attitude becomes an accepted morality, and that morality becomes impacted within the culture. And that's where we are right now. It's really become a culturally accepted reality. And tragically, within the Catholic faithful, a great majority of our Catholic faithful believe that this intrinsic evil is permissible. It's a real challenge today because, again, all these things have impacted the way they think about it, the way they approach it, and the way that it's modeled, and the way that and sadly has been presented to them. And so it's important for us to understand what we're up against as we try to advance those goods. So the significance of the human body. This is important because your spouse, each other, remember, we're not something to be used. We have inherent dignity. We are someone. The view of the human body implies that a human dignity applies to the body as well. So remember, the dualistic view tries to separate these, right? It tries to say, I have a mind and I have a body, and tries to pull that apart. I have a soul and I have a body, tries to pull this apart. The Christian anthropology that we advance recognizes, again, that we are body and soul, and that same dignity applies to the body itself. And that is why within the conjugal expression of love and the conjugal act, as I quoted in the very beginning, there's a language of the body. There's a language that is being spoken and a sacred word that is being offered to each other. And so when we try to change that, we're speaking a different language. We have spoken a different word. Therefore, the body too must be respected and not to be used as an object of pleasure or utility. In other words, the human body has a moral importance. So this is important as we discuss this issue. The whole person, body and soul, must be respected. Disrespect for the person's dignity fails to view human beings as ends in themselves and instead treats them as a means. That's what happens when we try to redefine it, when we falsify this good. We make it into something that it is not ever meant to be. And so tragically, disrespect of human dignity often takes place in human sexuality. Because of the effect of the original sin, women and men are viewed as objects of pleasure, Paul VI. In response, what do? The catechesis of the theology of the body which again, if you're not familiar with of John Paul's great catechesis on Wednesdays, it is worth the time and always the expertise in reading. And it's very important to look at that. So let's look at this God's act here. And I'm going to bring that now, in so that as we have our thoughts, keeping the abstract in the beginning and now looking at this part. With God's creation, sex and procreation are inextricably connected. This is one of the most self-evident facts that we know. They are connected. It is given to us in our being from the moment we are conceived. Men and women are bodily, sexual beings, and the human body reveals the person. All right? So it reveals, which again goes back to this falsification we see in the gender ideology. Femininity and masculinity are complementary gifts through which human sexuality is an integrating part of a concrete capacity for love, which God has inscribed in man and woman. As sexual persons, every aspect of our bodies and indeed our minds points to the fact that sexuality has a teleology, an end, a goal, a purpose. The church has consistently taught that this teleological orientation is twofold. The matrimonial covenant by which a man and woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life is by its nature ordered toward the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of children. The sign of holy matrimony is composed of two elements. Here's where the efficacious part comes in to play. The vows that the groom and bride exchange during their wedding. And the second is the conjugal act that consummates their marriage. These are the two elements. The conjugal act and all future conjugal acts must always ratify the words exchanged in those vows. The vows that the groom and the bride exchanged on the day of their wedding. Expressing the wedding vows of loving each other for life and procreating and educating new members of the body of Christ. That's what every conjugal act is to bring to bear. To bear those vows in good times and bad, rich or poor, sickness and health, the bond that it's meant to give witness to. Only in this way will the body language of husband and wife truly express the truth about the conjugal meaning of the body, the capacity that God has inscribed in the human body to express true love, always open to life. God has inscribed in the bodies of men and women the capacity to express that love. Again, the conjugal meaning of the body is expressed sexually when man and woman unite themselves in the conjugal act within marriage. Authentic love is by its very nature always open to life. So just kind of pulling us back. What is the intrinsic nature of the conjugal act? Love, unity, and the capacity to engender human life. So here again, we're just returning to those goods. So when someone speaks to us about, the issue, let's say, of contraception, how can we talk about it? Very easily, we talk about the good of it. We talk about what is good within this marital embrace. What is good that God wishes for this marital embrace? What is the good that God wishes to have revealed in this marital embrace? What is the good that God wishes to come forth from the fruit of that marital embrace? What is it meant to be? Even, in reality is so many don't hear this kind of language. They're coming from broken homes, wounded environments, divorce situations. Maybe their mother and father are cohabitating with another person. Maybe they already themselves have been in some kind of sexual encounter, already promiscuous in some kind of way. So they're bringing all that into this moment without understanding the very nature of themselves, the very nature of the human person, the very nature of what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God, and what it means to render to God what belongs to God. This is foreign language. They don't understand. But that's where we have to come in. That's where we have to be patient, and we have to sit down and talk it out. And I would say as a parish priest, and when I was in parish ministry, this is an area that I spent an ample amount of time in educating, forming, not just for those preparing for marriage. This was taught within the catechetical programs. It was taught, with adult ministry. It was taught in all of our programs working with young couples preparing for marriage. And I continue to do it after marriage. Because again, we need to remind people of the good. This is something good. All right? We're promoting what is good. Trying to put this in the mind, in the heart, so that we understand. And just to kind of, again, just pull it down. And then I'm going to conclude. So what I like to do is just look at this right here. So true love is when the human person gives himself or herself to others in service. Love is a self-gift. Love is also seeing oneself and others as ends in themselves and as gifts from God. Authentic love is when we become ourselves a gift from God to others, and at the same time when we welcome others in our lives as gifts from God. In the case of marriage, the spouses give and receive each other as gifts from God, especially in the conjugal act. Hence, according to John Paul, when spouses practice authentic love, they are truly expressing the conjugal meaning of the body by means of a true language of the body. In other words, they are truly expressing the conjugal meaning of that body. Otherwise, the language is false. So I'm going to stop right there. And what I want to do is just to end with this. There's so much that has happened. And again, what Dr. Morris has done has given a very good gift to all of us. By laying down the groundwork about what has this mindset done, where did it begin, what has happened as a result, where has it led us. And this important here is what I'd like us to walk away with is to really recognize that we can change the direction. We can alter the mind and framework of how people operate. And we can do this because we have with us this grace to be able to bear witness to truth. What we've done here in this very brief moment is the truth about what marriage is, what the nature of marriage is, what the purpose of marriage is, and what the purpose of conjugal love and the conjugal act are all about. And that is something that we should not be ever afraid to talk about or afraid to stand up and profess. And I wish, for example, those in the medical vocation would be able to have this kind of conversation with especially a young couple who come to them, at the very beginning of their marital life and asking questions about, issues of their marital love, to talk about the beauty of what conjugal love is, and fact of it is, and not even have contraception even on the mind. But that's not done. And then when they come to parish priest, what happens? Most priests cower away from it because they think it's something that we shouldn't be talking about. No, we should be talking about it. And it should be preached. And we should be able to sit down with our grandchildren and your great-grandchildren and with your nieces and nephews and others and be able to bring this up. Don't ever be afraid of advancing the truth. There's something beautiful here, something precious to defend and protect, something beautiful to advance. And that's what I wanted to do today. And I hope I did it somewhat, in a sense, by talking about something that we would need a few days to really broaden. But the understanding is there's a good. And I want that good to be something that for those of you who are still married or who are married and maybe have been possibly struggling with this issue, I'm hoping in some kind of way that this will touch you. For those of you who have friends, and we all do, who are married people, that, I give you an example, and that's what I'm going to close with. I was sitting down recently for Christmas time with some different friends, and one young couple who has been living their faith and just so excited to be married and so excited to be able to live their conjugal love, started talking about, the very beauty of being open to life and welcoming life, and they couldn't wait to have their first child, and, and they were just enjoying being married, and they were radiating. And this other couple said, well, have you thought about the financial consequences? Have you thought about where you're going to live? Have you thought about this? And, maybe you might want to consider postponing an i.e. contracept for a while. Boy, did I leap into that conversation. I think they regretted inviting me over for tiramisu. Don't be afraid of preaching the good. That's what I want to end with. Don't be afraid of preaching the good. So I'm very proud of you, very grateful to you, and I pray that, the good work that we are doing, we continue to want to advance. So I will give these slides over to FLI so that they'll have them, and if they wish to use them in a way that maybe they can do some other catechesis, and so breaking it down a little bit more. Okay? All right, thanks for your patience. I know you're tired. God bless.